So today we are very excited to be launching the first of our webinars of our diversity training series for 2021. By way of background, of course, the Centre for Cultural Diversity in Ageing is funded by the Department of Health under the Partners in Culturally Appropriate Care program and supported by Benetas. This series of webinars is designed to contribute to our vision that all aged care consumers experience inclusive and accessible care along the full spectrum of aged care services. The themes we've chosen for these webinars are in response to a survey we conducted of aged care providers earlier this year. And so the whole series actually reflects what some of the themes people pointed out were important to them. Of course, when we talk about accessing services, language and communication are always at the forefront. Being able to communicate in your preferred language is key to that experience, and so it's from here that we launch our discussions. That is, by exploring how we can work effectively with interpreters within different aged care settings. I'm delighted to be able to welcome our presenters for today, Jen Cvetkovski and Julie Hallifax, both Senior Account Managers at TIS National. They'll be walking us through the services that are available to us as aged care providers and some of the strategies that we can adopt to make sure we make the best use of these interpreter services. So welcome, Jen and Julie.
Thank you, Tanina and Lisa, for inviting us to present today. So just an overview of what TIS National services we provide. So we have immediate phone interpreting, pre-booked phone interpreting, on-site interpreting, video conference or telehealth, and we also have an automated telephone service, ATIS. So that's just an overview of the types of services that we provide, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail. So how does the language affect an individual's access to service? So negotiating services for someone who speaks a language other than English can be difficult when there is limited information available in their preferred language. The services display cultural insensitivities, attitudes towards them. Staff are not adequately trained in cross-cultural communications, and clients are afraid that they may be misunderstood. Clients are reluctant to share their personal or private information due to fear of shame or stigma. The services do not use trained interpreters, which can also be an issue with getting some miscommunications as well. So it's very important that we use a credentialed interpreter wherever possible. So when should you use an immediate telephone interpreter? So if you have a non-English speaker and they indicate that they need immediate access to a phone interpreter, or when an immediate message needs to be conveyed to a client and you don't have time to make a booking, the immediate service is the best option. ATIS is also an immediate service, and you can also get up to 10% discount for that one. So when should I book a pre-booked phone interpreter? So if you have a scheduled appointment with the client, if the assignment is complex and may take some time, 30 minutes or more, if you require specialist knowledge, and where the availability of interpreters in a particular language is limited, pre-booking a phone interpreter is a suitable option to ensure that you have an interpreter ready for the appointment. So when should you use an on-site or a video conference interpreter? There are many reasons where you may need, it may be preferred to use on-site or video, but this is just a few examples of in the aged care settings where it may be appropriate. So if you have assessments, care plans, admissions, if you need to explain the rights and responsibilities when you're collecting personal information, gaining consent, complaints and feedback is also very important to ensure you're getting the correct message across, and pastoral care. So we recently launched telehealth video interpreting. At the moment, it's just available to general practitioners, medical specialists, nurse practitioner, and allied health professionals. Eventually, we will roll it out to everyone, but at the moment, these are the options available. So if you have Skype, Zoom, WebEx, all of these types of platforms are available to use. You just need the access codes to join the video conference and the hyperlink for the interpreter to also join the conference, and obviously the contact name and phone number if the interpreter has any difficulties getting into the meeting. That's just an overview, but if you need more details, we also have an instruction guide on our website. So now we'll get into the funded interpreting for aged care providers. So we, PIS National, work closely with the Department of Health to provide the funded interpreting services to my aged care consumers. There are a number of programs available for funded accounts, so where the invoices go directly to Department of Health. The main programs that are utilised are the aged care facility programs, the home care packages, and the Commonwealth Home Support. Recently, there was an older person's COVID support line that was also included in the funded packages. If you have any questions about how the funded process works, we're happy to answer your questions via email or on our client liaison phone number, just down the bottom. And yes, if you may already have an account set up, or you may need a new one set up. So the role of family, friends and staff in appointments is basically you should try to get a credentialed interpreter before a family member, staff or friend is asked to help. It's not acceptable to ask children under 18 years of age for your clients from a culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds. There are many risks and impacts to using family or friends to interpret. Some of the risks can be inappropriate healthcare decisions being made, such as an incorrect or a lack of medical diagnosis. There could be instances where complex medical or legal terms are misinterpreted. Decisions could be made by someone other than the person receiving the service, such as a husband or a child. There could be a conflict of interest. For example, a family member interpreting for the will, they could leave things out, or there could be misinterpretations there. There could be unintended harm or exposure to emotionally distressing information for carers. It basically compromises the accountability and standards of conduct compared to those provided by a credentialed interpreter. If there is no interpreter used, there can be potential risk to your client, such as emergency visits to the hospital. So the role of the interpreter is to provide a professional interpreting service, ensuring accurate communication between English and non-English speakers. The interpreter should convey the whole spoken message from one language to another, adopting the delivery and the tone without distortion or omission. They should maintain the integrity, impartiality, and confidentiality of assignments. So you should be confident that they will keep the information private to themselves. They need to maintain the ethical, professional standards of the AUSIT Code of Ethics and Code of Conduct, which they are bound by. Australian interpreters are credentialed and work as independent contractors through a language service provider. So your role as the agency, you actually have a very important role to ensure the interaction with the non-English speaking client and the interpreter runs smoothly. So this includes some of the most important things is to lead and drive the conversation. You need to clarify the information when you identify either the non-English speaker or the interpreter may be struggling to understand. It's very important to allow the interpreter to clarify the information throughout the session. If you're not sure if the message is getting across, you can find alternative ways of communicating that will make sense to the non-English speaker in their own language. It's important to be respectful and appreciate that interpreters can be impacted by the exposures to sensitive topics and by the behaviour and attitude of others. There are many cultural sensitivities which a lot of people are not aware of. It's very important to be sensitive to cultural differences, which means being aware that cultural differences and similarities between people exist without assigning them a value, positive or negative, better or worse, or right or wrong. So for gender, if you have a sensitive appointment, you may need to consider whether it's appropriate that you request a male or a female. In these types of appointments, you may wish to ask them if they have a preference, because in languages that are more unique, it may reduce your chances of getting an interpreter. So in those types of cases, an interpreter, male or female, may be better than no interpreter. For sensitive appointments, it's very important to frequently check in to ensure they are feeling safe. Some of the information that they are providing could be quite sensitive. Many cultures have very different family values, which differ culture to culture. So if you have time, it's really good to do a little bit of research just to have an understanding of that. So with shame and stigma, there are many things that cause shame or stigma to family. Some families may actually deny that mental health conditions exist, and they avoid seeking treatment altogether because they're worried about shame or stigma. That's just one example, but there are many other ones. But I think that would be maybe most common one. So NAATI accreditation. TIS National recruits interpreters who are credentialed by the National Accreditation Authority for Translators and Interpreters, so NAATI. NAATI is the national standards and accreditation body for translators and interpreters in Australia. NAATI's primary purpose is to strengthen inclusion and participation in Australian society by assisting in meeting its diverse and changing communication needs and expectations. So the interpreters are bound by the AUSIT Code of Ethics, which means that they must display professional conduct, confidentiality, competence, accuracy, professional relationships, professional development, and professional solidarity. So interpreter availability. We recognise that interpreters not always available. There could be many factors affecting why they're not available, such as the demand, the availability, the location, the lead time, and the size of the interpreter pool in a specific language. So if you get a telephone interpreter, that draws on the national pool of interpreters. On-site requests can be more difficult to fulfil as the availability is limited to what is in the local area. So if you don't have an interpreter living in a remote area, then it's unlikely that you will be able to get an on-site interpreter, and then you would consider either using a video or a phone interpreter. So we also have an interpreter liaison team. They continually analyse unmet demand. So in instances where you can't get an interpreter for specific languages nationally, and they also work with communities to appoint interpreters in these locations. I will now hand over to Julie, who's going to talk to you about how to work effectively with interpreters.
So just before I jump into some of the tips for working with interpreters, we do have some great resources available on our website, one of which is a video, and that's the screenshot of it, hints and tips for working with interpreters. But there's a whole bunch of resources available on our TIS National website, including promoting interpreting services to your clients in language. So we have a basic script that could be available in about 10 different languages. So if any of you need access to wanting to promote on your websites the use of TIS National and interpreting services with your clients, specifically those that are funded under the programs that Jen mentioned, then we have a whole bunch of resources that we can tap you into. So looking at tips for interpreting, some of the things cross over, quite some of the basic things, I guess, cross over between on-site interpreting and phone interpreting, but obviously there are some nuances. Specifically for on-site interpreting, obviously organising a private area where the session can take place in a closed room, whether that's an on-site or telehealth. Obviously, even over the telephone, you want a private area where private information is being shared and not an open space. So introducing yourself to the interpreter and the client and providing a short briefing to the interpreter on the main topics that you'll be discussing is really important. Arranging seating in a triangular form to allow for easy communication between the interpreter, the non-English speaker and yourself. This is obviously only specific for on-site interpreting, but also you could somehow put this forward in the shape if you had video conferencing facilities available. And positioning yourself so that the client is directly facing you and that the interpreter is sitting slightly to the side, because this then just means that your engagement is happening there with the client and you're making eye contact with the client. Be aware, obviously, of cultural differences, such as something like the level of appropriate eye contact. Really important to speak in the first person and to speak directly to the client. Allow the interpreter time to clarify information if necessary. I really can't stress this point enough because it is just so important to give the interpreter that time to, take in that information and relay that information in language. Obviously, those of you who speak another language will know how nuanced language can be, and not every word is able to be interpreted word for word. So as Jen mentioned, it's really about delivering that source message without omission, but that sometimes means having to clarify information with yourself or, repeating something to the client that might extend for a longer period of time than you might have expected, I guess. So using clear language and obviously short sentences and pausing often, really important. Obviously avoid using jargon, slang or idioms, proverbs, no, all out. As a public servant, we are very much into our jargon, and often people are like, what does that acronym stand for? So obviously in the aged care sector, you have your own set of language, glossary terms. Really important that you put these in plain, simple language so that your clients and the interpreters who may not be as familiar with this language are able to interpret. Always great if you can allow the interpreter to have a short break, particularly if the assignment is lengthy, complex in nature. So, somewhere around the 30-minute mark, or if you're having an hour and a half session, maybe 45-minute mark would be great. Also gives everybody in the room really time to clear their head. So tips for telephone interpreting. So if the call will go beyond half an hour, you actually have the ability to, if you're making an immediate telephone call, you have the ability to speak to our operator and let them know, for example, that the call might be sensitive in nature. Maybe you're talking about incontinence. You might want to give the interpreter the heads up just so that they're aware that that's what the discussion will be about. And it also means that if they're not comfortable talking about certain issues such as, domestic violence or sexual reproduction or whatever it might be, it gives them the chance to opt out, obviously with keeping the client's information private, but just a bit of a heads up for the interpreters before going ahead. So ensuring the interpreter is aware of the type of telephone you're using and if they're on a speakerphone. So you can imagine if everyone's on speakerphones, you're calling out to a client, you're on a speakerphone, the client's on a speakerphone and the interpreter, the quality of the call is not going to be possibly at the best it could be. So getting everyone sort of getting that awareness of what they're using. If you're having trouble hearing the interpreter, you can always request that they move to a quieter area and or take you off speakerphone. Brief the interpreter on the main topics you'll be discussing. That's really important. It helps the interpreter just get it, as I said, get get that information in and know, okay, well, this is what the discussion will be about. Again, always speaking in the first person and speaking directly to the non-English speaking client over the telephone as well, rather than through the interpreter. And again, allowing the interpreter time to clarify information if necessary. And that might be even more important over the telephone because things can get lost in translation and it just might be a little bit more difficult when you've got 3 parties and potentially other family members on other telephones or in the background. Again, using clear language, short sentences, and pausing often, and avoiding those jargon and the slang that we talked about. Once again, allowing interpreters to have short breaks if the assignment is lengthy and are complex in nature. And really important is to indicate at the end of the conference call to everyone involved that it is ending. You'd be surprised how many times we've had either the non-English speaking client hanging on the line after the interpreter and the client have hung up because they're like, okay, what's happening here? Where's everyone gone? And vice versa. Sometimes we see the interpreters hanging on because no one's actually said to them, okay, thanks, interpreter. Thanks for your time. The call's now ending. Thanks, client. Thanks for your time. So really important to let that, to clarify that at the end. So I thought what we do today is run through a couple of case studies. Bear with me now. I have to actually hop onto another system, which Tanina and Lisa have kindly provided us, and we've just tried to work those into some of our understanding and sort of try and draw it back to the AUSIT Code of Ethics, which really is sort of a benchmark for service providers. It's a benchmark for interpreters, but it's also a really good way for you to understand what we expect of interpreters and what you should be expecting of interpreters. Okay, so the first scenario that we're looking at is in an aged care facility. It involves a care planning session with the client. There's also a family member present, as well as an interpreter. So Julie works at a residential aged care facility and is conducting a care planning session with a resident and their family who don't speak English. Julie's booked an on-site interpreter via TIS National for 2 hours and has provided a short briefing in the job booking form on what will be covered in the session, including who will be present and the topics being discussed. The interpreter has read the notes prior to accepting the job and has accepted the job knowing full well that they're confident in interpreting in this setting and with the topics that will be discussed. The session starts well with Julie introducing herself to the client and the family. Julie then pauses to allow time for the interpreter to interpret that introduction, but also gives time for the interpreter to introduce themselves. The interpreter is given that opportunity and then is able to outline their role in the session, highlighting that they're bound by the AUSIT Code of Ethics, that they're there to ensure that they remain impartial, that they won't be advocating on behalf of the client or the consumer, and that all information interpreted will remain confidential. Once Julie has walked through the care treatment and the care plan, she begins to introduce the topic of finances. As this information is complex, she refrains from using acronyms, talks in short sentences, and allows time for the interpreter to interpret the information. She also checks in with the client regularly to ensure they understand what is being said. On one occasion, Julie asked the client to repeat what has been asked, which the interpreter relays back to her. And that gives her the confidence then that the client is actually understanding what has been, the information that has been delivered. At the 1 hour mark, Julie calls for a short break to allow all parties to grab a glass of water and use the bathroom. The interpreter is very appreciative of this small gesture. As the session continues, Julie notices that the family members are having private conversations amongst each other. When Julie questions the family member, she's told that they do not want the interpreter to interpret all of the information because they're worried that their mum might react or the reaction of their mum. While this is happening, the interpreter proceeds to interpret this information in line with their responsibilities and commitment to communicate all that has been said without omission. It's not the interpreter's responsibility to exclude information because it might be sensitive or it might not go down well. However, obviously the interpreter doing this, it makes the family members quite agitated and there's a bit of muttering going on. Julie picks up this very quickly, that the body language has changed, and she immediately advises the family members that she has a duty of care to ensure that the client understands what will be involved in their care plan, and that omitting information to the client would be unethical. Julie reiterates to the family that the interpreter's role is to ensure that everything that is spoken is communicated to the client in their language without omission. If a family member doesn't want something interpreted, they should actually just refrain from saying it, because the interpreter is required to relay this information. As I said before, it's not their job to decide what is and isn't information. They're there to interpret what is being said. The session continues to run smoothly, and Julie walks away feeling very confident that the client and the family have understood the information, despite the small issue that they had earlier on. So I guess I just wanted to highlight probably what seems very obvious now to you, that you've all been going through this, but I guess some of the important things. So Julie utilised the booking form that we have. So we have a pre-booking form for telephone. We also have a booking form for on-site jobs. And Julie used that as a briefing, a pre-briefing for the interpreter prior to the job, which we strongly encourage you to do. This essentially allows the interpreter to undertake some research, refresh their knowledge of any specific terminology that might be used in the aged care sector. So Julie paused often, and she allowed the interpreter enough time to communicate the information. Julie identified an issue and made sure it was clear to everyone in the room that all that was spoken needed to be interpreted. Julie politely led the conversation, and she didn't allow the family or the interpreter to dominate the session throughout, which I'm sure from your own experience you may have found that can be the case. Julie provided a break for the interpreter and also provided that support to the interpreter when the family became agitated. So I'm going to move on to scenario 2. We're at an older person's home. There's an aged care assessment being undertaken with a team member. There's the non-English speaking client, a family member, and again, an interpreter. So Georgia works in the aged care assessment team and is conducting an assessment with a client and their family who don't speak English. The client is also hearing impaired, and today they're not wearing their aid. Georgia booked an on-site interpreter and has put notes in the job in relation to what will be discussed in the meeting. The interpreter arrives early, so Georgia uses the time to notify the interpreter that the client also has a hearing impairment and that they have forgotten their aid today. So just to be aware. So the interpreter says that they're obviously confident interpreting in this setting and is happy, everything going forward. The session starts really well, and Georgia introduces herself to the client and their family. Georgia pauses to allow the interpreter to interpret the introduction and for the interpreter to introduce themselves. The interpreter outlines their role in the session, again, highlighting their role under the AUSIT Code of Ethics, particularly in relation to confidentiality, impartiality. So during the assessment, a family member continually interrupts the conversation. They're answering questions on behalf of the consumer or just to help the client out in language or in English. So the interpreter proceeds to interpret these interruptions in their language, in line with their commitment again to communicate all that's being said without omission. However, the family member also talks over the top of the interpreter while they are interpreting this information. So it becomes very confusing. The client also appears to be struggling with the dynamics in the room. So that makes things difficult again. So Georgia suggests that taking a break might be a good idea. Have some time to go to the bathroom, have a glass of water, and that gives her an opportunity to consider how she's going to improve the session, because the way it's going, it's probably not going to turn out so great. So when they come back, Georgia returns from the break. She's feeling a lot more confident and in control, and she actually proceeds to rearrange the seating. So she's kind of realised after the fact that due to the fact that the client is hearing impaired and hasn't bought their hearing aid, the best thing to do would be to place the interpreter directly in front of them so that they could at least be lip reading and understanding each other more clearly. So she rearranges the seating, interpreters directly in front, and that allows for that easier communication. Georgia politely asks everyone to take turns not talk over the top of each other, as this obviously can make it very, very difficult for the interpreter to undertake their job. She also requests that the interpreter speaks louder to assist the non-English speaking client. So Georgia also reminds the family members that the non-English speaker needs to answer the questions directly, and that given the client's hearing impairment, they should relay the information directly to the interpreter to avoid any confusion or error. The session runs a lot smoother now that Georgia has rearranged things and sort of redefined her role, I guess, and she feels confident now that the client has understood the information despite the earlier issues that they faced. So just to highlight a few of the wonderful things that Georgia did, Georgia put notes in the booking form. Again, she enabled the interpreter to get a briefing before they even arrived on the job. So really important. Reduces the risk of any conflict of interest, and it provides an opportunity for the interpreter to prepare, as we've said. By pausing often, she allowed to communicate information accurately. Georgia was able to identify an issue when the family member attempted to dominate the session and requested a short break to clear everyone's head and start fresh. On return, Georgia politely took the lead in the conversation and clarified the role of each party and arranged the setting again to ensure that the best flow of communication was happening at the time. So if anyone's got any, well, I'm sure you've all got some real life experiences on this, but we'll open it up for question time a little bit later. But I just wanted to move forward and just let you know about our feedback process. So we're telling you all this partly because if you have an experience, whether it's a positive experience, we love positive feedback about our interpreters. Interpreters also love to hear positive feedback. They work in a very insular space, so they don't get a lot of feedback. So if you feel that the interpreter's done a great job at the time, feel free to tell them and let them know, and alternatively put it in writing to us. That's wonderful. But of course, if you do have a negative experience, if you're worried about the quality of the interpreting, if the interpreter's conduct isn't appropriate or you don't feel happy with that, we want to hear that information. If you're having trouble with the actual service in terms of technical issues while calling our immediate telephone service, we want to hear that also. So we have a pretty robust feedback process. We receive your feedback that gets allocated to someone in our interpreter liaison team. We give all of our interpreters the right of reply. We don't necessarily just take on face value what's been given to us. Some of the case studies we just showed you just hopefully give you an idea of how nuanced it can be, and simple communication things that, you know, you as the client can do and lead the conversation can actually change the whole dynamic of the conversation. So something small like moving the chairs changed the whole flow of the conversation. If she didn't move around, if she didn't take the lead, that's probably the sort of thing that will come back in our feedback tray and say, okay, this is what went wrong. So please, yeah, as I said, we give the interpreter the right of reply, and then we look at your feedback. Where necessary, we will provide additional coaching and counselling to the interpreter to say, look, it's not appropriate to talk over the top of the client or the non-English speaker, whatever that might be. So we give everyone the right of reply, and then we will provide you with a formal letter of response. But I guess the important thing is if you don't tell us there's a problem, we can't fix it. So we really do want to hear what you have to say, because without that information, we can't identify if there are ongoing issues with a particular interpreter, but your feedback and lodging that against the interpreter's file allows us to do that. So I'm going to throw it out to the universe for questions.
I did receive just a couple of questions via the chat, actually. One was whether you have some idea when the video platforms will come into use for aged care providers, if there's a bit of a time frame for that Jen talked about.
So in terms of what is available now, if you're in an aged care facility, I would say that there would be no issue with accessing video conferencing. A lot of the work, I imagine, in aged care facilities would fall under the allied health space. I could be wrong, but I have seen situations, particularly in aged care facilities, where they've requested a video conferencing interpreter. Jen and I are able to sort of be a bit more supportive at that level. So if we sort of identify that this is a situation where they really, if we look at COVID, there was no other way to do it basically in aged care facilities. So a lot of the video conferencing was happening during COVID in that sector, in that space. Commonwealth Home Support, I would say that there's quite a few assignments there that would fall under providing care and assistance or support at home, whether it's a nurse visiting someone's house. Probably the only one that would be a little bit tricky at the moment is if you're discussing a home care package and you're nutting out a care plan, or a home care package plan, I should say, that might not fall into it. But unfortunately, at the moment, we don't have a date, but I can tell you that it's in the pipeline, and we're all very keen, and everyone up there is very keen to get it moving and out to everybody, not just the current stakeholders.
Excellent. Okay, that's good. On that note, actually, there's another question here from Jennifer saying, how are aged care facilities organised to make the bookings for such a video call, and do I give a link for Healthcare Direct to the facility for the interpreter to use the interpreter?
So in terms of the actual how to create a telehealth booking, it's very similar to an on-site booking. So you need to go into TIS Online. You need to be registered as a booking agent. And if you're not on the account, then you can just send us an email and we can add you if we have your signature block, or the account administrator can actually add you to that. But yeah, the telehealth booking is basically the same way that you would book an on-site job in TIS Online, but you obviously need to have the hyperlink for the video meeting, and you put that in your booking form.
Just add as well, with the aged care facilities, what Jen and I find is, so I don't know how many moons ago, but basically when the aged care facilities came under I think it was DSS back then, under that funding arrangement, they basically created all these accounts, but we're not too sure how well they advertise that to actual aged care facilities. Mm. So we often find that an aged care facility will register a new account, but we have a look in the system and there's already one in there. So if you're if there's anyone in here from an aged care facility, the best thing to do would probably get in touch with our frontline team or Jen and myself in the first instance. We can then look up into the system and say, okay, your facility already has a registered account with us. Then we could add the practice manager or the relevant parties to the account and get you up and running that way. But we do find that a lot of people are unaware that they already have an account with TIS National. Maybe somebody new somewhere along the way, they moved on, didn't pass the information on to the next person. So feel free to get in touch with us.
I think that actually raises an important question around how the organisations themselves manage the account internally. So having some sort of policy framework or system where it's really clearly understood, this is our account number, this is how the process works, this is who you contact, should you want to use an interpreter. So have an internal procedure that outlines all the specifics around how to access TIS National services. Having a policy framework really is what I'm saying. And if anybody needs assistance with that, we would be happy here at the centre to provide you with a bit of an idea of how you might be able to put together a policy framework and a procedure to do that. We've already got some resources on our website that might be able to help you, but if anybody would like any further assistance, please reach out to us, because it's really, really critically important that that, you know, we make the best use of this resource, which is an incredibly important and free resource, and we make sure everybody's on board.
Yeah. And we certainly, Jen and I, have done quite a lot of work working directly. We've worked with Benetas, Uniting, Bolton Clark to try and, because we're basically talking about two different systems, and we try and basically work together to bring the two things together so that we can, you know, we've had input in, you know, operating procedures or task cards, whatever they might be, just to make sure that the information service providers are giving staff is consistent with how we actually do things at our end. So we're more than welcome, you know, capacity within reason to try and work with providers to try and make it as easy as possible. Because as you said, Tanina, there's free interpreting out there, and I think we definitely need to be tapping into it.
It's incredibly important. I'm hoping Rowan is still with us, but he had a question around what's the meaning of professional solidarity, something you brought up, Jen, in the context of AUSIT Code of Ethics. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? Basically what it means is if there is a dispute with their interpreting, that the interpreter needs to resolve the dispute in a constructive and cooperative and a professional manner. It's basically the definition of what that means.
Professional solidarity. Yeah. Okay.
In the context of the code of ethics that they're bound by.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What I'd like to invite people to do is actually have a conversation directly with Julie and Jen should you want some more information. They're very accessible people. It's part of their role to actually get information out to the community, to yourselves, to organisations. There are many, many resources on the TIS National website, including a really good video. And also, you know, from my experience, having done a lot of training in the area of working with interpreters and also had some personal experience with it myself, it's one of those areas of work where practice makes perfect. It's not necessarily a natural situation to be communicating with someone through someone else, and it takes a bit of practice, and it takes time to build confidence. I've had some pretty terrible situations that I've been involved in, and you know, you learn from each one as you go to the next. So some people lose encouragement when they have a bad experience in an interpreter situation, but we really shouldn't let that stop us from moving to the next one and really looking at interpreters as a really key resource in all our work moving forward.
There was one more question, if we had time to answer it, Tanina. It just says, if a client wants to provide feedback about their experience with an interpreter, but they need an interpreter to access the feedback site, what are their options? Basically, the answer to that, all they need to do is call TIS 131450, state what language they need, and then request to be connected to the Global Feedback Unit. And TIS will know the number automatically, and then the Global Feedback Unit can explain how to lodge the feedback to the non-English speaker.
I really hope that this session has given you a really good overview and of the services offered by TIS National, and that you are aware that, you know, there are many, many resources available to you in this space, including on our website. We have, for example, a practice guide around working with interpreters. We have a template for a policy on working with interpreters as well, just for example. We have many, many other webinars coming up, so make sure you check out our training page on the website. We have them running through right to the end of September. Also, just a reminder about our inclusive service portal. We have a portal. I'd like to invite you all to jump onto our website and to register for the Inclusive Service Standards portal. This is a free online platform to help your organisation to embed inclusive practices across all policies, strategies and service provision. The portal also gives you access to all the aged care diversity action plans. So it's been set up to be able to help people work through all the different standards and the action plans. And we'll be sending that link to you after the session so that you have a direct link to where it is on our website. And also by registering for the portal, you'll be able to be eligible to join what we're calling our new Communities of Practice initiative, where you'll be able to access diversity coaching, peer learning and mentoring opportunities. So we will be advertising in May. We're having our first Communities of Practice session, and if you are already registered on the portal, you'll be invited to come along to that. And we'll be having online sort of conversations and coaching around the different standards and action plans that you can get involved in.